It was you. You're the monster.
Joe Goldberg isn't just a killer, he's a romantic fantasist who believes he's always the hero of his own story. In all 5 seasons of You, we watch him justify stalking, manipulation and murder, all through the calm, persuasive inner monologue that makes us root for him. Joe is a complicated character, but through all his ups and downs, season 5 of You wraps up the story in a perfect way in my opinion. I've seen mixed reviews online around season 5 and specifically the finale. Going into the season, it was unclear on how Joe's story would end, as in my opinion he didn't really deserve a happy ending. Death seemed like a bit of an easy way out, and prison just felt not justified enough. So spoilers ahead, but I'm going to go through why I think Joe Goldberg got the perfect ending in my opinion. In the penultimate episode of You, Joe is currently known by the world for being a killer, and his goal is currently to kill his ex-wife Kate, get back his son Henry, and live Joe's version of happily ever after with Louise. Ultimately, Kate ends up tricking Joe and locks him in the cage in his basement at Mooney's. However, Joe ends up escaping with the help of Louise, and Mooney's shop ends up being burnt down. Joe then proposes to Louise, and it is then revealed how Louise actually feels about Joe. Previously, she was confused about how she felt, as her initial intention was to catfish him, but she ended up falling in love with him despite knowing what he is. But after speaking to Miriam and Kate, she was finally convinced of Joe's true nature after seeing previous people fall for him as well, just like she did. While Joe is proposing, you hear Louise narrate her thoughts, and she says she should leave him, but then there'd be no justice, and she is the only person who can stop him. As she says yes to him, she reveals she's planning to stop him, and that he won't see it coming, which leads us to the finale episode. This episode starts off with Joe and Louise running off. Joe is currently wanted by the authorities and is famous for being a murderer. We don't know how Joe is currently being perceived by the outside world at this point, as the last we see, he was trying to kill Kate and the world still knows him for being a serial killer. We know Kate got a confession out of him and sent it to Nadia, who would have sent it to the authorities. But Joe and Louise are on the run, and there was an interesting dynamic as they're on 2 different pages. While Joe thinks they're running off together to spend the rest of their life in some romantic setting, Louise now sees Joe for what he is, a serial killer who has to be stopped, and she is on a mission to kill Joe, but not before she gets closure on Guinevere Beck's death. For once in Joe's relationship, Joe is the one fully in delusion, and Louise is the one stringing him along. Louise knew she had to kill Joe this evening, as she didn't want to be intimate with him, and she knew that eventually Joe would suspect she's being disingenuous. Ultimately, Louise was convinced by Kate and Miriam about Joe's true nature, and this is what pushed her over the edge. While at the house, Joe and Louise were on a boat and had a romantic moment where they were staring at each other in the stars. And to me this was a great write, because even though Louise knew what he is and was literally minutes away from trying to kill him, she still feels good in this moment and is still slightly seduced by him. She narrates, "Is this how good Beck felt before you killed her?" and describes it as peak romance, which was a good build up to the end of the relationship. It showed how Joe was so good at seducing people, and at heart this is why his partners ended up falling for him. In this scene we hear Louise's thoughts, but what's interesting is that we couldn't, as the audience, if we didn't know what she was thinking, we would have no idea she was planning to kill Joe, as she was very good at hiding this, and in turn managed to manipulate Joe. Back at the house, Louise finally pulled a gun on Joe, made him remove all of his add-ons to Gwen's book to give Gwen her voice back. In the middle of this, Joe got a call from his son, which was one of the best scenes in the season for me. Despite Joe's downfalls, in his eyes he did try and be the best father he could and protect Henry how he could. Despite all of his mess in Joe's life, such as murders, affairs, and the rest of the world seeing his true colours, he always wanted to protect Henry and shield Henry's thoughts from the views of others. However, Henry called him a monster. Joe and Henry sees Joe's true colours, and this was a good nod to what Love said in season 3 before she died, saying Henry would eventually see who he is. With this happening, you could actually see how deeply it affects Joe. At this point, Henry was the only one Joe cared about, and his only legitimate family, but this is what pushes Joe over the edge to finally attack Louise. There was a high intensity fight between the two, with Louise being shot and Joe chasing after her. Joe goes full unhinged serial killer, chasing her through the forest in just his boxers, which in my eyes was symbolism that he had no more layers to him, and this was the real him. Ultimately, Louise finds him in the forest and points a gun at him. Joe was on his knees, begging for her to kill him, as the idea of going to jail for the rest of his life was a prospect which scared him more than anything. He would have literally rather been dead than alone at this point. and that's how deep Joe's trauma really stems. He ran at Louise and Louise shot him but didn't kill him, instead hitting his private parts. In the next scene we see Joe in court getting sentenced for all the murders he has committed. And then when we cut to the prison cell, it was complete silence. We see him reading The Executioner's Song, which is a novel about how a serial killer embraces his death sentence instead of fighting against it. This was true torture for Joe, and even in this moment, Joe still feels like he has been hardened by. He reads a fan letter out, with it stating how someone wants him to put them in his cage, and almost fantasizes about Joe's obsessive behaviour. He then goes on to say, "Maybe the problem isn't me, it's you." I felt like this fitted quite well with the reaction to Joe's character outside the show. Joe was handsome and gained a lot of attention from women that were fans of the show, even though he was a serial killer. I thought the final scenes of this episode were really good, as it was actually Louise narrating it, which was different from what we're used to, where Joe pretty much narrates over 95% of the show so far, and it was a fresh perspective on how things were going. And in a way, Louise was a representation of the girlfriend that managed to get away and not getting killed to Joe. Louise got a good ending where she fully managed to move on in her life and didn't let the events of Joe define her in any way. And in a way, I felt like she got redemption for the other people Joe had killed, specifically Beck, as Beck's new book was published without Joe's input and is performing even better, giving Beck her moment even though she is dead, which made the 5 seasons come to a full circle closure. Ultimately, Joe's downfall was he was delusional. Throughout the season, this was one of Joe's many flaws, and in this season it highlights it perfectly. Everyone in the public eye has seen Joe killed, and despite Joe being on the run, he still believes Louise loves him for being him, and that they're running off to their happily ever after. He even speaks at the start of the episode of him eventually getting Henry back, and this was the same delusion that kept him going throughout all 5 seasons. However, this finally caught up with him, and Louise finally saw him for his true colours before it was too late. Not only was it satisfactory to see Joe in the prison, but what made this so good was all the wrap-up it gave to the other characters and the build throughout the whole episode. From the first scene of them driving in the car, to the romantic boat scene, to the call with Henry, and the final chase at the end. Not only this, but the only thing that felt like home to Joe was Moonies in New York. For me, you was either going to end up Joe being in prison or dead, and I wasn't really sure which one would have worked best. But how Joe's story finished with him going to jail I think was very fitting. Ultimately, jail was more of a torturous ending for Joe. Even when we see him at the end, he had a plain face, shaven head and a prison uniform. He looked a lot more like a serial killer than he did at the start of season 5, where he appeared a lot more confident, charismatic, good looking, nice hair and nice clothes. I almost felt like death would have been an easy way out for Joe. Now he's trapped in a cell, similar to how he would trap people in his box. The thing that kills Joe the most about being in jail is that the loneliness he's now going to feel. After all those years of trying to pursue love, he's now never going to get it. We do also see Kate, Henry, Mariam, Nadia and Maddie, who were all victims of Joe in a way, get the closest thing they could get to a happy ending, which definitely helped balance you out as there were so many deaths among the 5 seasons. It was nice to see some people actually get away from Joe and go on to live a good life. I think the final episode of You was a perfect ending for Joe and the series of You. At the start of the season, Joe ultimately had his ideal life: his son, wife, access to resources and wealth, fame, a good job, and was even able to reopen his old bookstore. But this season highlighted why Joe is always going to sabotage himself, and he's never romantically satisfied and always finds an excuse to kill someone. I'm glad they didn't end Joe as the charming hero, but more of the villain of the series, as ultimately, as much as we like him as a character, this is what he was. So ultimately Joe ended up in his own version of hell.